Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel and welcome to my review of Cyber Pet Quest. This is coming to us from Dead Alive Games and is designed by Brendan Kendrick and Bernie Lynn. This is a solo or cooperative campaign game for 1 to 4 players, 4 cybernetically enhanced animals trying to find their way back to their owner. And this stars Jane the cat, Clay the Australian sheepdog, Roman the goose, and Freya the raccoon. Now, what really caught my eye with Cyber Pet Quest is that it is a very small box game, kind of promising a big campaign experience. On one side, we have the mechanics, actual gameplay of what we're doing in this and how enjoyable is that. And on the other hand, we have the kind of narrative and story of the game, right? Why are you aiming to make this campaign game in the first place? Let's talk about the mechanics first. Now, like I said before, in Cyber Pet Quest, we are going to be controlling these 4 different animals, and all 4 animals are going to be in play regardless of the play size. All the animals are going to have a few actions that's going to be shared between them, and they're all going to have their own kind of signature powers that's going to be specific to them. You can see on the player board here, we have kind of 3 main resources that you're going to be tracking. There's going to be energy that's going to be spent in order to do actions. There's going to be luck that's going to be used to fuel these other items that you're going to get throughout the game. And of course, you're going to have your health. If you ever fall to 0, you get knocked out, and you're gonna have to rely on one of your animal companions in order to heal you up to get back in the action. If everyone gets knocked out, then that's gonna be a lost condition for the game. Now, the way that a turn is going to be determined in this game is using these 2 initiative decks. And I really enjoy how they do the initiative in this game. There's going to be a set of cards for the Pets initiative, and then a set of cards for the enemy initiatives that are called Sims, which are like these rampaging, cybernetically enhanced people. We'll get to that when I talk about kind of the narrative side of it. But those are going to be the enemies that you're going up against in this game. Those initiative decks are going to be shuffled at the start of a round, and you're going to alternate turns between the Pets and the Sims. So you don't know exactly who's going to activate, but you have an idea of which side is always going to be alternating with the Pets and the Sims back and forth. Once all of those cards run through, you shuffle them back up, and it's going to be the end of a round. Now, the first thing you're going to do on a Pet's turn is roll the 3 energy dice, and this is going to determine any extra energy or luck you're going to generate at the start of your turn. Every pet is going to have a base amount of energy that they can use on a turn, plus whatever they roll. And any clovers that they roll are going to be added to their pool of luck, is going to be used to power any charms that they might have. These are just little items that you collect along the way. They're going to give you some extra things that you can do on your turn. Now, the next thing you need to choose is important to enemy targeting, and it's the kind of way that they handle targeting in this game, and that is with the aggro token. And so on a pet's turn, you have to choose if you either want to take the aggro token, meaning that when enemies activate, they are going to target you, or you can choose to go into sneak mode, meaning that enemies are not going to target you, but you have to spend a little bit extra energy to do things like move or interact with objects, right? Because you are moving slower, you're being sneaky, it's a little less efficient to run around the map doing stuff. So it's a little bit of a push and pull, choosing if you want to be in aggro mode and do things a little more freely, or if you want to be more restrained in sneak mode and not risk taking a whole bunch of attacks. Now, once you choose if you're going to go into aggro or sneak mode, you're free to go about doing your actions, spending that energy you generated in order to do things like move around the map, investigate spots, interact with objects, fight enemies, or heal. And you're free to use that energy in whatever order you want to do these different actions. Every character is going to have a different energy cost. Some are more efficient at fighting, some are more efficient at running around the map, and it's going to be different depending on which character you're playing as. But they're all going to share that core concept of having to spend energy to do these different actions. After you're done doing all the actions you want to, any remaining energy is converted into luck. So I like that it lets you not feel like you need to use all this energy. Sometimes passing is a valid strategy if you want to stockpile some luck in order to use some of those charms later on. Now, once a pet is done with their turn, you're going to flip over a Sims initiative card, and it's going to have a color on there to tell you which enemy to activate. Depending on the difficulty you're playing on, you're going to move that enemy a certain amount of spaces towards their target, which is typically going to be whoever is holding the aggro token, and then you're going to deal a certain amount of damage to every pet it moves through. So there's a certain amount of strategy in choosing who takes the aggro token and the risk of drawing enemies through your groups of allies, and they're going to take a ton of attacks if you're not careful with how you juggle the aggro token. And then depending on the difficulty, they're also going to see the amount of damage that an enemy has to be dealt in order to stun them. Now, one thing I really like about this game is how it handles enemy management. There's no real way to like kill or remove an enemy most of the time from this board. You can stun them for a turn, but you're still like a relatively powerless animal. I like that thematically it really feels like you are kind of like up against the odds, right? You're really kind of like just trying to piece together your survival, each of these missions, stunning enemies, using tricks, using items in Home Alone or something, and you're like, you can kind of like deal with enemies, but there's no real way that you can actually deal with them. You have to focus on the objectives and try to get those done to actually win these missions. Now, one more thing to mention on the Sims turn when they do damage is that there is also this pink dodge dice. And so every character is going to have a different threshold of what they need to roll on this dodge dice in order to avoid a certain amount of damage. This again leads into some of the different personalities for play that each of these characters have. Some of them are more efficient at dodging than others. Some have more health to just tank hits. After a Sims resolves all of the actions on its difficulty card, then you're going to flip over a pet card, and then they're going to go. And again, that's going to alternate back and forth. After those initiative decks run through, you're going to increase the number on the round tracker. And that's going to be important because every mission is going to have a time limit of what round you need to complete the primary objective, or else it's considered a loss. And so one round is once you run through all of these Pets and Sims initiative. Now, there's one more thing to talk about when we are talking about the Sims, right? The enemies in this game, and that is going to be the boss cards. About halfway through the campaign, they start to introduce boss enemies into each of these missions. They're going to have a lot of special abilities. They're really going to change how you approach the game. So while the first 3 missions are more or less, I wouldn't say tutorial, but really helping you get comfortable with the system. And in that respect, I feel like the game truly doesn't begin until you get about halfway through it. Once those boss monsters are introduced, you have alternate win conditions, alternate loss conditions, and I think it really makes the actual strategy of how you have to approach these missions that much more interesting. I really, really enjoyed that kind of mid-edition of these boss enemies. Now, one more thing to mention as far as animal loadouts go is that throughout these missions, you may also encounter these different item tokens. And that's going to allow these animals to pick up these different items they're going to find along the way that are going to be one-time use abilities that are going to be critical to beat some of those boss enemies. This isn't a game where I feel like I was able to like hoard items. It really felt like they were an integral part to the difficulty of really using these strategically and trying to get these objectives done. And if you're enjoying the video, please consider liking and subscribing to join the channel. I do a lot of reviews and previews and list videos and all sorts of board game content, and I'd love to have you on board. Anyway, back to our cyber pet adventure. And so that pretty much sums up the gameplay side of it. You're going to be generating this energy and luck, doing actions to fight enemies or complete objectives, and a lot of the kind of interesting stuff in this game is going to come depending on which mission you're playing on. Now, the actual kind of actions and selections sounds pretty simple, but a lot of the interesting complexity is going to come from each of these specific missions. I'm really impressed by what they're able to do with really most of the game is made up of these small cards, but a lot of the kind of interconnecting in-game narrative that they tell you with objectives is really, really quite interesting. That brings us to the actual narrative of this game, and another thing that really drew me to it. This idea of playing as these like cybernetically enhanced animals is really interesting to me. There's a phenomenal Grant Morrison comic called We 3 that is also about these like animals turned into weapons. It's way more graphic than Cyber Pet Quest, but it's a cool idea, right? We also saw it in Guardians of the Galaxy 3, right? Having these animals kind of like cybernetically experimented on. And the kind of kicking off event for this story is that there's this virus that starts causing people that have these implants to start going crazy, attacking people. And while the narrative is all told through the eyes of the innocent and kind of like simple-minded animals trying to get back to their owner, there's a lot of kind of contextual information in the flavor text, in the description of characters, that I think is really interesting. And look, I'm not saying we're at like neuromancer levels of cyberpunk storytelling here, but I do think that the world that they created is really interesting, and I think the glimpses that you get through the pet's eyes are a really cool way to explore this world that's a little bit darker without having to dive into like these depressing cyberpunk dystopian themes. Now, the actual way that this narrative is going to be structured is that there's going to be 6 main missions in the game, but there's a couple of key points where things are going to branch off. The first 2 missions serve as kind of a tutorial to ease you into the game, and then immediately from there it's going to split into chapters 2A, 2B, 3A, 3B, and then chapter 4, there's 4 different routes that you can go with a couple options to revisit some past paths if you want to kind of get some more items and kind of beef up your characters a little bit more. And then missions 5 and 6 serve as the kind of penultimate and then the final boss fight for the game. And that brings us to the 4 main characters, the 4 main animals of this game that you're going to be playing as in every mission. And they do have a nice little introduction to all of them in the story, but I think something that the game does really well is that their actual abilities, their kind of resource cost, the way that they play really adds to their personality, right? Freya is very much kind of the item grabber, like able to get extra item cards and distribute them to their allies. Clay is kind of the tank, right? The frontline fighter. Roman is super annoying and is able to kind of distract enemies and like manipulate them around the map. And then Jane is kind of your all-rounder, like evasive, right? She's a cat. And I think that the way that the gameplay informs their character works really, really well. It's simple. There's a couple of subtle changes between them, but I think it's an effective way to tell the story with these characters. And while I do love what each of these animals contributes from a gameplay perspective, it does bring up one of my negatives for the game, and that's going to be that all 4 of these animals have to be active in every mission. And I understand why that is, right? These missions are balanced around each of these animals contributing different things in order to kind of complete these objectives. It's just part of the DNA of the game that it's the story of these 4 animals. I played this purely solo for my first playthrough, but as you play through this campaign and your characters level up, you get more charms, you get more signature abilities, you introduce bosses and more enemies, it does become quite a bit of upkeep to really keep track of everything as you're playing these more complex scenarios. But if you are approaching this from a purely solo perspective, just keep that in mind that there is a little bit of upkeep. And now speaking of some of those later missions, this is where I felt a little bit of the creakiness of trying to fit a whole lot into a small package. And that's with some of those more complex bosses or some of those more complex objectives on maps where I had to read those cards a couple times to really comprehend what they were trying to say was the main objective or what the action I had to do actually was. And again, it's nothing that was like scenario breaking or like ruined the game for me, but it is something to mention if you're getting for this for someone who maybe is newer to board games and doesn't like understand the language of how games necessarily work, it might be a struggle for them. But if you are playing this cooperatively with someone who is newer to games, you can kind of shoulder that burden and help to kind of translate some of that. So that leaves us with the ultimate question of, is Cyber Pet Quest successful in creating this kind of introductory, friendly way to teach a dungeon crawl and campaign game? And I think largely it really is. I think the fact that it has an interesting theme, it has these animals, it is not like dark fantasy or horror or sci-fi or something. I think this like very bright cyberpunk animals that you're playing as are going to be really, really attractive to people. It also really helps that the actual core gameplay of this game is really, really simple and straightforward. And I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but the fact that your turns, it's very clear, you have energy, you spend it to do actions, you have luck, you use it to activate your items, and that's pretty much it. And really the interesting and the complexity is going to be driven by taking aggro tokens and seeing where enemies are positioned and going after these different objectives and trying to coordinate with your teammates or yourself if you're playing solo how you want to position your animals to complete these objectives, right? I appreciate that the complexity doesn't come from the turn structure, but it's really driven by those specific scenarios. I think if you want to kind of introduce someone to dungeon crawls and kind of like tactical gameplay on a map like this, I think this is a brilliant way to do it. Both because the theme is very approachable and the turns are simple, is that it is only 6 missions long. There's a couple options to loop back and play additional missions, but the bare minimum, you can get through this story in 6 missions. And each mission is like an hour or so long, and so you can knock this out in a weekend or like a couple weeks at most. And I think that being able to tell this story in a board game, in a small compact box, in a couple missions, I think is a really big achievement for Cyber Pet Quest. And while you probably could complete this campaign in a single long playthrough session, it also comes with these nice envelopes to track your chapter, your carried over luck and health, your level, the different charms that you have, and these nice little envelopes with the different pets' names on them. Just a nice little touch to keep track of your character in between sessions if you are kind of breaking it up between multiple days. And so overall, I'm going to be giving Cyber Pet Quest a solid recommendation with a Silver Apprentice meeple. It comes in a compact package. It has this really nice approachable theme with these animals trying to find their owner. I think it's really easy for people to get invested in this story. They get assigned their animal, you start to get connected to it, you see it grow throughout the campaign. It just has a lot of good stuff going for it. It's also really solid mechanically. The turn structure is simple and straightforward. A lot of the complexity and interesting stuff is driven by those specific scenarios. So as you play through the campaign, that complexity kind of naturally evolves with you. Those bosses aren't introduced until like halfway through the game when you're already pretty comfortable. So even if you're a new player, you don't have to be like, whoa, this boss is like too much, I can't handle this. You've had time to kind of adapt to the game as you've been playing it. I really, really like the enemy targeting system in this game. I think that the aggro system of on your turn, you have to choose if you want to draw the enemy's attention or not is really interesting. It adds to a lot of good strategic decisions of where you want to position your pets, what enemies have and haven't gone yet, what's the risk of dragging enemies to certain parts of the map, or if you want to go into sneak mode and go way slower, but not risk having to mess up where enemies are on this map. I think that's probably my favorite kind of tactical decision in the game, is if you want to go into aggro mode or not, and how you're going to manage the enemies with the items that you have, and a whole bunch of other kind of cascading decisions. If it wasn't for a couple of the kind of creaks that I felt towards the end of the game with some of the complexity leading to a little bit of confusion on my end, I think this would be an even stronger recommendation. And I think this is a really good first showing for this Cyber Pet Quest system. I hope they revisit it. I hope they tell another story with these 4 animals, or maybe 4 new ones. And I think if they really tighten up some of the text on the cards, especially later on, and just kind of refine a couple things, I think this is a really solid and fun system. I'd like to thank Dead Alive Games for providing a review copy for this video, and while they do provide the game, they have no editorial input on what is covered in this video. I also want to mention that we are playing the deluxe version of this game, with the main differences being that the meeples have some screen printed graphics on them, as well as the dual layer boards, which are nice but not necessary. So thank you again for joining me in this review of Cyber Pet Quest, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.